The history of Ostwacht. Ostwacht, in 1032, was the closest outpost of the imperial army to the dwarven kingdom of Kragdal, and the direct front in the war against the dwarves. The outpost was surrounded by palisades, and a stone citadel was built inside the castle. This fortification was intended to prevent the dwarves from taking the fortress. After Ochsenwacht, Ostwacht was the second largest army camp on the island. Directly adjacent to the army posts was the Miracle Forest. People baptized the forest accordingly, as it bloomed in all colors and life flourished there. Flora and fauna, animal and man lived in harmony, and the aura of the forest had something magical about it. It was as if the forest almost radiated something soothing. One walked on light soles through the forest. It was precisely through this beauty that the forest radiated that one could almost have forgotten that the forest was the only strategic obstacle between the front of the dwarves and the empire. The only way to Kragdal led over the almost insurmountable mountains of the Sky Peak, at whose icy peaks such an angry wind blew, as if the mountain wanted to protect the dwarves. A major offensive on the Miracle Forest by the Imperial Army was phenomenally prevented by King Dal with a ruse. Shortly before, as the Imperial Army advanced through the forest, the King of the Dwarves made a pact on Flea with a powerful dragon that lived in the caves of the Sky Peak. He offered the dragon half of his wealth, so that in return the dragon would reduce the forest and the adjacent fortress to rubble and ashes. The dwarves also appreciated the Wonder Forest, the Miracle Forest, which they called Kirdruer in their language. King Dal sealed the agreement with the beast only with a heavy heart. He knew that his decision would only bring chaos and destruction. When the army of the Empire entered the forest and marched towards the dwarf fortress, the dragon did as he was told, and the Miracle Forest turned into an irrepressible inferno of fire. The dragon spat hellfire from its burning lungs down into the forest. He beat his wings and fell on the people again and again. As far as the eye could see, the flames spread in all directions of the forest. The air lost all oxygen to breathe, and it rained only ash. The dragon fought its way into rage, spewed fire, flapped its wings wildly, crushed, tore, and ate anyone who got in its way. The creature of hell brought much mischief on that memorable day. The plumes of smoke rose to the sky, and the people in Ochsenwacht held their breath when they saw the catastrophe that had occurred at the other end of the island. The dragon let go of its spectacle, rose into the air, and was last seen flying towards the top of the sky. The men of the Imperial Army, a total of 5,000 foot soldiers and 500 cavalrymen, who made a large-scale advance on Kragdal, burned alive, and those who miraculously survived the inferno were subsequently destroyed by the counterattack of an advancing dwarf regiment under King Dal. Countless lives were destroyed on this single day, and the many corpses of the mostly young men of the Empire, surrounded by charred trees, paved the burned forest floor. Ostwacht was also a victim of dragonfire that day. Individual pieces of the citadel wall melted under the scorching heat of the fire. From then on, Ostwacht was only a ruin. The Emperor, so incensed by the news of the terrible defeat of his army expedition in Flea, caused a dark magician to deal with the problem on Flea. Since the reserves on Flea were very small and the Empire had no further recruits available for the time being, the wars on other fronts of the Empire had a higher priority. The necromancer Kardush was tasked with resurrecting the Imperial ranks and getting the dead of the Miracle Forest ready for battle again. Kardush's expedition reached Flee and stationed itself in the ruins of Ostwacht, and Kardush began working with his sinister rituals and dark magic. At night, thunderclouds flashed and repeatedly illuminated the black floor of the now destroyed forest. Out of nowhere, the previously fallen soldiers and warriors suddenly walked again on the smoking plains. They had risen to the undead. Corpses, grotesquely disfigured, shuffling, croaking, and mourning, trapped in the clutches of Kardush, eternal servants of the necromancer. The fallen of the Imperial army rose up in the places where they had just been slain, burned, and murdered. They just got up and walked through the burned forest to Kragdal. The armies of the undead were so overpowering and unstoppable for the dwarves, which prompted them to perform the Great Barrier spell in a last desperate contingent to protect themselves from the overwhelming masses and save the people. The dwarves threw themselves into battle with the dead, with the undead, and fought wildly against the walking dead. The sight of those monsters made fear go to their bones, and yet they stood up to the superiority. King Dal struck his warhammer again and again. He drove the dwarves appeal to their courage and duty to save the people, come what may. But the superiority of the dead was too great. More and more, the endless wave of monsters pushed the dwarves back into the mountain. The dwarves lasted just long enough for the magical ritual of the barrier to be performed. But then something happened that until today could not be fully explained. What we do know today, however, is that the great magic failed and the great empire of Kragdal was buried until this day. The men who watched as the armies of undead shuffled over the ashes of the now black Miracle Forest henceforth named this forest only as a forest of the dead. The war on Flee ended with the resurrection of the dead and the burial of the dwarf empire, and since then the north of the country has been uninhabited and blocked. It is said that ghosts still haunt the burned forest and that the necromancer never left the citadel. Again and again, there were adventurers and treasure hunters who moved to the north of the island in hope of riches. However, nothing has been seen of them anymore.